Yes, on. Turn that off. One, two, three, four, five. 1, 1, 2, 1. Have you got the monitoring set up right? The monitor, as in on QuickTime. Have you you sorted that? Yeah. So you should be able to hear this. It's coming into here, and you're getting signal here. So. Yeah. You turn that up. Test 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, very good. Hello, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. It's a real joy to welcome you all to Pusey House for this conference, Receiving Nicaea, a conference in memory of Elizabeth Livingston. My name is George Westaver. I'm the principal here at Pusey House. There will be a tribute to Betsy Livingston before the 4 p.m. lecture. The 4 p.m. lecture will be given by the Reverend Dr. Mark Smith of Clare College, Cambridge, Nicaea Then and Now. And if you want to read a fuller tribute of Betsy Livingston, you have one in the back of your conference document, a very fine tribute prepared by Professor Andrew Louth, Father Andrew Louth. In a few minutes, my colleague at Pusey House, Dr. John Ritzema, will say more about the conference, the character of the conference. I'm going to say mostly a few practical things and words of welcome. The conference is part of our vocation to encourage study and serious engagement with the life of the university in union with the life of worship and prayer and a formational community life. It's part of the reason why we continue our usual round of worship as part of our conferences here at Pusey House. So evensong after our 4 o'clock lecture, there'll be evensong at 5:30. Our preacher will be Father Khaled Anatolius. Very good to have you here also. And then a musical performance. I think I'm very much looking forward to it, Bach's Credo from the Mass in B minor, performed by the Oxford Bach soloists. That'll be around 6:30. The conference wouldn't be possible without the support, the generous support of a number of donors. The Faculty of Theology have enabled us to provide reduced-priced student tickets. We're grateful to Mark von Grondel for his support for the concert, also to Robert Jackson and SCIO, Scholarship in Christianity in Oxford, also for supporting the concert. The estate of Betsy Livingston is generously supporting the closing drinks reception tomorrow. After evensong tomorrow, there will be a closing drinks reception at which Dr. Rowan Williams will offer some words in tribute to Betsy. We're also grateful to Marek Matrajak, who helps to fund the academic work of the house, and in particular supports the work of Dr. Jonathan Price, the Matrajak Fellow at Pusey House and at St. Cross College. And I'm sure that you will want me to thank, in particular, all our speakers. It really is a great act of generosity to give so much of your time, making time to be here for the conference and preparation for the lectures. We're very grateful indeed. And we're also grateful for all the helpers you'll see moving about making today work. One note about the timings. I've misled you already. I started 5 minutes late. After now, we're going to start on time for everything. We'll try to help you by reminding you in the coffee. If you've been at our summer conferences, you know that what I'm saying is true. We will start on time. I'd suggest coming back a few minutes early because we're not going to take away from the speaker's time, and we're not going to take away from your time having the chance to have time for a conversation either. Now, a few practical things. There are no fire drills scheduled for this week. So in the very unlikely event that there's a fire alarm goes off, you can exit via the west door or along the corridor by the stairs, out the back, or even out the front door. Please be careful when you're walking about. The chapel, wonderful sense of lift by the way the floor drops a number of times, but easy trip hazard. There are toilets at the back of the chapel, cross the cloister, down the stairs, or back to the lodge and into the St. Cross common room. The porters will let you in if the door is locked. We very much hope that you enjoy this afternoon, and tomorrow I'm going to hand over to Dr. John Ritsema, who will say more about our time together.
Good afternoon. I will be very, very brief. As the principal has said, my name is John Ritsema. I'm a Pharos Foundation Research Fellow in Theology here at Oxford, working mainly on the Old Testament, but I'm delighted to join you in the impossibly futuristic world of the 4th century AD today. I spend most of my time at Oriel College, but also work here at the Centre for Theology, Law and Culture at Pusey House. So I'd like to join the principal in welcoming you all here today. The conference that we're very pleased to be hosting this afternoon and tomorrow is one of many that have been held around the world in a variety of both secular and ecclesial contexts to mark the 1700th anniversary of that first ecumenical council at Nicaea. And we are particularly grateful to all of our speakers for sort of gamely joining us in one last foray into the council at the close of this great anniversary year. I'm sure absolutely nobody here needs reminding of the immeasurable significance of the council to the development of Christian doctrine in the history of the church. Its definitive symbol grew into the great Catholic creed that we only slightly mislabel as Nicene today. It stands at the fountainhead of the canon law. It stands at the fountainhead of the brave new world of Christian political theology that develops in the Constantinian period. But you know all that. We're very grateful for the support of the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at Oxford. At Pusey House in general, and at this conference in particular, we are really keen to bring together the worlds of university-based academic theology on the one hand and ecclesial theology in the churches on the other. That's, of course, the main reason that this place was founded, in both the memory of and the furtherance of the life and work of Edward Bouverie Pusey. So we're really glad that this conference has attracted the interest of people in academia, but also of clergy, of ordinands, and of interested lay people here in Oxford and elsewhere. We're delighted to have you all here. So what does this conference add to the plethora of Nicene gatherings that have already been held this year? You'll see from our programme and from the title Receiving Nicaea, which is not only a nod to Professor Anatolios' similarly named book, that we've been keen to put together a lineup of speakers who will delve not only into the synod itself in its immediate 4th century context, but will pay a lot of attention to its longer-term reception, including here in the Church of England. We've also been really glad to host a couple of preliminary events in the last few weeks, for which thanks are due. Earlier in the academic term, Father Andrew Louth gave us a foretaste of today's discussions in his lecture in the House's Recollection series on the establishment of the homoousion at and after the Synod. It's an excellent lecture, and it's publicly available on Pusey House's YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it yourself, or if you'd like to recommend it to your students or congregations. We also hosted last Saturday a study day aimed at both our congregation here and at the general public. That was hosted by Russell Jefford, and we're very grateful to him for having led us in that meeting on Saturday. And finally, as the principal just mentioned, this conference is being held in memory of the late Betsy Livingston, and other people over the next day and a half will touch on her great significance to the study of the early church and to both ecclesial and academic life here in Oxford. But I'll draw your attention just once more to that lovely reflection which has been written by Professor Louth, which you can find in your programmes. Without any further ado, and to march strictly to time, I will hand you back over to the principal, who's going to introduce our first speakers. Hope you enjoy the conference.
Very glad to introduce Professor Johannes Zachhuber, who's accepted this invitation bravely. I just reminded him that on a dark night last winter, I rolled silently up beside him while he was rushing to the station, pulled off my very large yellow hood, and asked if he'd like to come and speak at this conference. And he didn't flee. Here he is today. Thank you so much. Professor Zachhuber is the Professor of Historical and Systematic Theology at the University of Oxford and a Fellow and Tutor of Trinity College. His research specializes in two main areas: late ancient Christian theology, together with its philosophical background, and 19th century Christian thought. Before coming to Trinity, he studied at Oxford and then taught theology at Humboldt University in Berlin. He's the author of Human Nature and Gregory of Nyssa and The Rise of Christian Theology and the End of Ancient Metaphysics. His paper is entitled Nicaea Between Tradition and Innovation. Professor Zachhuber.
Hello. Well, thank you, George, for these kind words of introduction. I have vivid memories of our encounter on Broad Street in this dark night, so I'm sure it will become part of Oxford lore at some point. It's really great to be here and speak to you today. I feel honored and also a bit scared to be the first, but to make the best of it, I decided to go for a somewhat open-ended paper that hopefully will set us up for the discussion of the next 2 days. The price to pay for that, perhaps, but you'll judge that for yourselves, is that I may raise more questions than I answer, but you'll see about that in a moment. Now, the title which George already mentioned may strike you as somewhat counterintuitive perhaps. Nicaea between a tradition and innovation. Isn't Nicaea really all about tradition? Isn't it tradition, as we might say, in all caps and bold? So what about tradition and innovation here? Well, I would argue that the answer to that depends a little. If we consider the tradition that Nicaea inaugurated, then it is, of course, accurate to say that this very soon, although not immediately, became accepted as normative and was subsequently received ecumenically, and you've heard it today, you've heard it on many other occasions throughout this year, so I don't really have to dwell much more about that. The Nicene Creed is the single most ecumenical formula of faith. Nicaea is a point of reference, if not for all Christians, but when can you ever say that? But nevertheless, for the vast majority of them, it unites churches in East and West, and even unites those in the East that were separated after the Christological controversies of the 5th and 6th centuries. So if we look at Nicaea in that way, it is indeed easy almost identify it with the notion of tradition. It's quite another matter, however, if we're asking about the relationship of the council to the preceding history of the earlier church. Right? If we don't ask about the tradition that Nicaea inaugurated, but the tradition in which it supposedly stands. On this account, I think it is fair to say that the council and its outcomes have been variously adjudicated, and that is true both for the immediate reception of the council in the 4th century, and it is also true about later interpretations. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. I'll explore some of those assessments. I'll begin with a few comments on the controversial debate about Nicaea that ensued soon after the council. So I'll begin my journey, so to speak, in the 4th century, and then I'll take you quickly, as much as is possible in the time that I have, through later stages of the reception of and debate about Nicaea and its creed, to conclude with some reflections on what it means that the council has this particular relationship with its earlier tradition and what that can possibly actually mean for us today in thinking about Nicaea and about our own situation as Christians in today's world. Without further ado, I go back to the 4th century, and I make this very brief, assuming, as John reminded us a minute ago, that these are all things that you've, or many of you will have heard, well, you can never hear them ad nauseam, right? It's too important for that, but you've heard them many times this year already. Now, the first point to make here is that in some ways Nicaea was obviously innovative, right? In some ways Nicaea was obviously novel, and at least some of that innovation perhaps wasn't ever controversial, but I definitely wouldn't think it deserves to be controversial. Let me mention 4 aspects, and we'll see that some of them are perhaps, or were at least, could be seen as more problematic than others. So in the first instance, we have the fact that Nicaea, we might say inevitably, was the first imperial senate that was convened by the emperor himself, and it was because of that arguably the most ecumenical, the most comprehensive gathering of bishops that had ever happened in Christianity up until that point. Well, it couldn't have been different, really, given that the conversion of Constantine really only happened a few years prior to the council. But of course, it was still significant, and it was obviously significant for the later reception of Nicaea that it innovated in this way, and we now think of it as the first ecumenical council. And as such, of course, it broke new ground. Secondly, it also broke new ground, we could say, in ecclesiological terms, simply by virtue of adopting a formula of faith that was to become a universal creed. Now, again, those of you familiar with scholarly debates about the 4th century will know that it's actually not entirely easy to say at what point it became clear that the formula of faith adopted in Nicaea was to be regarded as something like a universal creed. But, I leave that aside for today. It definitely happened in the decades soon after Nicaea, and so I count that as another major innovation that happened through that council, and another one that I would say, by and large, was or should be uncontroversial, but it's worthy of note that Nicaea did something for the first time, and that is adopt a creedal formula that was to be shared as the foundation of faith by all Catholic Christians. Now, these 2 first points, as I've said, shouldn't be too controversial. I come to 2 other innovations which I still think are should be beyond doubt, perhaps, but which were at the time, and in a way also later on, potentially seen as more difficult. And the first of those is doctrinal innovation, or is doctrinal, let's say, at least discontinuity. It is clear that the way the Nicene Creed speaks about the relationship between the Father and the Son, the rejection of any notion that the Son is in any form subordinate to the Father, which is expressed in terms such as, the Son isn't just God, he is aletheos, he's true God. And then, of course, in the famous, much discussed technical terms, he's from this being from the substance of the Father, and he's of the same being as the Father. So all these terms are used to express a very strong idea of the equality of the Trinitarian persons. I'll say more about that in a moment, but more than we normally find in earlier theology. And directly related to that, I mention a fourth point. I sort of already, in passing, alluded to that. The creed, which is by and large made up of biblical phrases, right? In some ways, it would be correct to describe the Nicene Creed as something like a collage of key scriptural terms, but it also contains a number of terms where that is not the case, and those are these famous, widely discussed technical terms from the being, from the substance of the Father and of the same being with the Father. So the Nicaea didn't just stipulate a creed, it included in the creed a technical terminology that was also novel at the time. Now, given all these areas of innovation, it is not surprising, perhaps, that the debate about Nicaea focused to a considerable extent on the charge which was raised by those opposed to the adoption of Nicaea, that the creed actually innovated in inappropriate ways, that it broke with firmly established traditions, and was therefore not supposed to be accepted by those people who simply wanted to follow in the tradition of what they considered as their fathers. And I will say frankly here that I've often found when you're reading these lengthy controversies, these lengthy contributions to the Trinitarian controversy at the time, it's sometimes hard not to feel a bit for some of the many Eastern bishops who were painted by St. Athanasius and by posterity as Arians, or at least as semi-Arians, even though it is very clear that these people had never, to their own knowledge, toyed with anything they considered heretical, but had much rather been stalwarts of traditional doctrine and faithful servants of their churches. So that's one of the sort of intriguing aspects of this debate, that a lot of those who oppose Nicaea, and at least oppose it in the form that Athanasius gave to it, thought of themselves and arguably were theological conservatives. To them, it seemed that Nicaea wasn't perhaps absolutely wrong, but that it rushed in, we might say, where angels feared to tread. Of course, they would agree, or many of them, most of those opponents would agree, that there were good reasons to align Jesus with God the Father as closely as possible. But was it wise to do so in the exclusive language that the Nicene formula had chosen? Were there not, for example, many biblical passages that quite unequivocally seem to point to a distinction in rank between the Son and the Father? Notably, Jesus himself says in the Gospel of John that the Father is greater than I. passage, that's a biblical verse that comes up time after time in these debates. And while Christ certainly was not part of God's creation as described in the book of Genesis, did he not say himself, and I don't know, that may not be intuitive to us, but it was intuitive to 4th century Christians, that Jesus spoke through the person of wisdom in Wisdom 8, when Lady Wisdom says, the Lord made me the beginning of his ways. So were there not weighty scriptural texts that would should guard us against a creed that excluded the possibility that there was any created dimension and that begetting was the only formulation that was appropriate to the relationship between the Father and the Son. And then, reiterating a point I made earlier, there were objections to the use of technical vocabulary not found in Scripture, notably the language of substance, which, again, many of these opponents would say might well be needed in theological exposition of the subtleties of Trinitarian doctrine. So yes, when we have to be very precise in our theological writing, we need that technical language. But is there justification? Is it right? Is it good to import this language into the foundational document of the faith as such? Because obviously once we do that, then theology will be partly not exposition of Scripture, but exposition of the creed, and it will therefore become a point of orthodoxy, how we understand a term like substance. But how can there be an orthodox position on how to understand a philosophical term? So these people felt we're really going down a very dangerous road. Now, that's all I'm going to say here for now on the contemporaneous or near contemporaneous objections to Nicaea on the grounds that it was too innovative, that it broke with an earlier tradition. As we all know, all these reservations did not change the outcome of the historical development, and in 381, at the Council of Constantinople, the Nicene faith was affirmed, and from that point onwards, the Roman Empire, with its authority, ensured that deviation from Nicaea as the official faith was not something that was tolerated. Now, I don't want to imply that was the only reason, but anyway, this was the end of the debate, and we don't actually, after that, have any further controversial debate about Nicaea for a very long time. Now, Moving on to the later reception, the first point I want to make is that it's probably fair to say that in the millennium or more following Nicaea, both in East and in West, in the East and in the West, the question of the relationship between the fathers of Nicaea and the earlier tradition is not really a question that gets asked at all. The fathers, for the later theologians, both in the Greek and the Latin churches, the fathers are simply the fathers of Nicaea. And if we look at the key theological edifices that were erected on the basis of the Nicene faith, we can think of the so-called Cappadocian theologians in the East, or in the West, we can think of Augustine. These are all the sort of key Nicene theologies. They sort of go back to Nicaea. The key criterion is agreement with the tradition that is initiated by Nicaea. And as a side effect of that, we look at the use these later theologians make of pre-Nicene theologians, and we find there's very, very little of that. Now, there are obviously some that very soon fall under suspicion, notably Origen, but others as well, such as Clement of Alexandria. But even if we look to those who are unquestionably orthodox, there's very little evidence that they're used, and I think that points to the fact that there was generally no awareness that it would be desirable or necessary to show not only that, not only what the fathers at Nicaea meant, but also how they built on an earlier patristic tradition. Now, this, however, changed, and it changed quite dramatically in the century after the Reformation. And I'm talking about Western Christianity now, where following the Reformation, the study of patristics became a major battleground between the emerging confessional blocs of Protestants and Catholics. In the 17th century, the first person I want to talk about a little more here is a very erudite Jesuit scholar, Denis Pétot, a French scholar, Dionysius Petavius in Latin. He was really the first person to write something like a history of doctrine. He was the supreme expert in the early 17th century for the early history of Christian theology. And so it really mattered that when he ultimately came down to pass his judgment on the relationship between Nicaea and the earlier tradition, he didn't mince his words, but said that it was clear that Nicaea was a break with the earlier tradition. In fact, Petavius said that Arius and his colleagues were much closer to the earlier tradition than the Council and St. Athanasius, who championed it. Now, at the time, there was a growing anti-Trinitarian movement across Europe, and these scattered few anti-Trinitarians, in a way, couldn't really quite believe their luck, that one of the most erudite scholars of the age, and a Catholic to boot, had made the case which they, with much more limited scholarly resources, had been trying to press home, which was, in their view, that Trinitarianism was only the product of the Constantinian age and not really the doctrine of the early church at all. So we have this ironic situation in the late 17th century that the greatest admirers of a Jesuit author were religious dissenters. But it has to be said that the anti-Trinitarians almost certainly misunderstood Petavius completely. His point was not at all to denigrate Nicaea or its doctrine. Rather, his interest behind his historical thesis was that he believed the council to have offered a necessary correction to an earlier tradition that had gone dangerously wrong or awry. The way it had gone wrong, Petavius believed, and this is a sort of a separate topic, the reason the earlier tradition had gone wrong, Petavius believed, was the influx of Platonic ideas in early Christianity. That would deserve more of a discussion that I'm going to give to it here. More important for my talk today is another reflection, another consideration to understand why Petavius took the view he took on Nicaea and its earlier tradition. It's important to see that he himself was looking back to another council, a more recent council, that was also accused by many people of having innovated, namely the Council of Trent. Now, we won't be surprised to hear that a Jesuit author would defend the Council of Trent against its critics. But it is interesting how he defends it. And Petavius defends Trent in exactly the same way he defends Nicaea. It's okay, as we might say, it's okay for the church to introduce new doctrines. That is part of her mission. And as much as the Council of Nicaea proves the point in the 4th century, the Council of Trent proves the same point in the 16th century. This becomes really very clear in a book by Petavius. I think very, very few people have actually read more recently. It's a book that's specifically entitled On the Doctrine of Augustine and of the Tridentine Synod, De Augustini Doctrina et Tridentina Synodo. And in this book, Petavius raises the question, should the council's teaching be judged by the standards of Augustine's theology, or should, vice versa, Augustine's theology be measured by its compatibility with the council? And his answer is an unequivocal yes to the latter. Augustine is an important author, but he's just one. The council, by contrast, is how the church speaks. And there are many problematic aspects for the Jesuit, of course. It doesn't really like the anti-Pelagian Augustine at all. Anyway, whether Trent is more favorable to his view is another matter. But he says, the Trent is quite right in correcting certain ideas that we find in earlier fathers. Now, of course, there were many who did not share Petavius's view that the Catholic Church is on a progressive trajectory that reaches new and fuller insights in the course of her historical journey. In fact, both inside the Catholic Church and outside it, many disagreed with that view. On this side of the channel, Anglican divines such as George Bull countered it with the scholarly attempt to show the homogeneity of doctrinal belief in the early church. And it's interesting to reflect that that actually is the historical origin of the view that many of us will be familiar with, that Nicaea is the embodiment of an earlier tradition. It's really the first time that case is made in response to Petavius in the late 17th and 18th century. So we could say, and again, it's perhaps a bit counterintuitive, but I think it's historically true, that the view that Nicaea has to be seen in historical continuity with the earliest church is a view that was at least originally inspired by a sort of, let's say, conservative form of Protestantism, for which it was important to hold the authority of Scripture together with the legitimacy of ecclesiastical decisions, and to this end emphasized historical continuity from the apostolic period onwards. Now the question still is how far this view is tenable. And this question continued to be discussed, and I will just very briefly touch on the 19th century, which, because George said, is one of my periods of historical specialization. I will very, very briefly mention two major theologians and scholars of that period who stand for radically different visions of the patristic past, and I'm thinking of John Henry Newman on the one hand and Adolf Harnack on the other. Now, I'm not going to tell you that they agree on their view of Nicaea. That would absolutely not be true. But they do actually agree more than you might think with regard to some of the questions that I've been discussed. Both of them actually were fairly clear-eyed on the impossibility to simply see Nicaea as a continuation of earlier theology. They saw that from their study of historical sources. But both nevertheless were adamant that Nicaea marked a legitimate departure. So, what do we take from that? If we drilled more deeply into why they thought Nicaea was legitimate, we'll get to their differences, and I can't really talk about that today. But it seems to me that this coincidence of opposites that we have here in the patristic vision of Newman on the one hand and Harnack on the other indicates that the important insight, which I want to take away from it, that if we actually want to talk about the significance of Nicaea, it cannot be decided without a properly theological judgment. We can't just rely on history here. We have to think theologically here. Nicene doctrine, I would say, is not vindicated by its coherence with the earlier tradition, or at least not entirely, but it is and must be vindicated by the appropriateness of its theological vision. But that, of course, brings us back to the question we might almost say from which we started, which is, what should this judgment be based on? Now, allow me at this point, in the last few minutes that I have, to circle back one more time to the 4th century, where I started. Now, I've said earlier that many of the opponents of the council in the 4th century complained about its deviation from the earlier doctrinal tradition. What I didn't tell you at the time, perhaps some of you noticed, what I didn't tell you at the time was how the defenders of Nicaea responded to that charge. So how did Athanasius and his allies defend the council against the charge that it deviated from tradition? Now, here's the, in my view, really quite interesting answer. The answer is that Athanasius, Basil, and the rest were really relatively little perturbed by what I might call the small print of history. We don't really find them making a massive case, as of course, people in the 5th and 6th century would do, about why the statement of theologian XYZ in the 3rd century could be squared with Nicaea. As a matter of fact, in the few cases where we get chapter and verse of an earlier bishop or an earlier synod that disagrees with Nicaea, they're kind of willing to diss them and basically say, yeah, they were wrong. But they did take very seriously another line of criticism, which we might say also falls under the heading of discontinuity. The line of attack against the council they took very seriously was the claim that Nicaea wasn't faithful to the testimony of Scripture. And would be the topic for another talk, but it seems to me that it's still really underappreciated how much the 4th century debate about Trinitarian theology was actually an exegetical debate. And for every passage that usually gets cited in historical textbooks and which engages a philosophical question, we have pages that are just about the detailed exegesis of the key Christological passages in the Old and the New Testament. And it's therefore, I don't know whether it's surprising, but it is therefore significant that it's really on this point that the Nicenes ultimately prevailed. But let me add that the Nicenes prevailed on the question of which Trinitarian theology was more scriptural, not by necessarily having what we might call the letter of Scripture on their side. But what they could show, I think, is that the fundamental message of the Christian Bible, both Old and New Testament, the gospel of human redemption through Jesus Christ, required a fully divine Jesus Christ. That was the key underlying message that we have in Athanasius and in everybody else who argued for Nicaea. And I think where they prevailed was in the argument that that view, we might say, was scripturally mandated. So that brings me finally to the question of what Nicaea teaches us today. Well, you may perhaps guess by now what I'm going to say. I think it is not. Nicaea doesn't teach us that adherence to tradition is the one and only measure by which Christian faith and practice should be adjudicated. But I'm also doubtful that Petavius was entirely right in thinking that the church, qua institution, had the right simply to change course when she so pleased. Rather, what we learn from the council is that if the church we learn from the council that the church needs to return to the witness of Scripture in order to place herself correctly between tradition and innovation. Thank you. Very much so, absolutely. Should I just stand here?
Yes, great. We have a bit of time for questions, conversation. I may kick off by asking Professor Zachhuber, might you say a bit about how John Henry Newman and Harnack thought that Nicaea was a development rather than a continuity? And if that question, well, maybe I'll just stop there. I was going to say that you could decide instead to delve more deeply into how the pro-Nicenes argued that theirs was the true interpretation of Scripture. But you can choose a question.
Well, I mean, that fills the next 15 minutes. Well, thank you, George. Two very pertinent questions. I mean, I've said that obviously the agreement between Newman and Harnack on Nicaea really only goes to a certain point. I mean, at the end of the day, it's actually very interesting that when it comes to the interpretation of what makes Arius wrong and what makes Nicaea right, they take almost exactly the opposite view. That for Newman, Nicaea confirms the kind of Alexandrian theology that he loves, and that Arius, sorry to say it like that, but that's what he says, is basically a Judaizer, somebody who is in thrall to sort of pre-Christian Old Testament-based view, whereas for Harnack, for whom the big problem, interestingly, like Petavius, is Platonization, as Platonism and Hellenization. Arius is the Platonizer, and Athanasius holds that against him. So I think they both really see that there is a sort of crisis in the early 4th century, but where they locate is very different. And I mean, just another word on Newman, because at one point I was hoping I'd be able to say a bit more about him today. Why would I have thought that? But would seem to be the right thing to do here. I mean, as many of you will know, he has this, in a way, really marvelous idea that in order to account for historical change, we need to think about it as organic development, and that something is legitimate if it can be seen as an organic continuity in change rather than a rupture. But I have to say that, try as I may, I find it very hard not to think that takes us to a sort of circular reasoning, and that we will always think that, of course, the person who chooses a particular perspective will see that as the organic development of an earlier point. Now, of course, you can avoid that, and I think that Newman at some point in his life agreed that that was the way to avoid it. If we then go back to a logic that isn't all that different from the one in Petavius, namely think that the continuity will always lie with the institution, and that therefore, if we're just, let's say, in the right church, the universal church, then that in itself guarantees that whatever change happens is not wrong. I mean, that would all merit much further elucidation. But anyway, that's my answer. That's my answer to that question. And I kind of almost wonder. Well, I can still say a word on the. I can still say something on the biblical defense. I mean, the biblical defense. Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a slightly awkward one for me to answer, because I've been so emphatic in saying they were right in their biblical argument, and now I'm probably forced to say that is true if we take a sort of bird's eye view and just look at look at the big picture. And the moment we drill down, things become murkier, right? So, for example, we look at. We look at texts like Proverbs 8, which they found hard to justify, or many other passages in the like Philippians 2 and many other passages that clearly seem to imply a subordination of the Son. They come up with this argument that all these passages are already said of the incarnate Christ, which sort of hard to believe, really, I have to say. It did the tricks, we could say, but so that's again. It's interesting that perhaps the way it isn't too awkward for me, I would still say it confirms the point I made, that if we just judge them by a sort of literalist exegesis of these texts, they're not always right. But if we judge them for the intuition of what sort of behind the text, they were right. The spirit and the letter.
Thank you. Before I ask 5 more questions, very back.
On the topic of tradition, contrary to how people tend to imagine him, Arius, as we know, was somewhat sort of flabbergasted by the suggestion that he was introducing any novelty or innovation in his teaching. He seems to have very firmly stuck to the conviction that, what are you talking about? This is what I've always taught and believed and received from my forebears. Inasmuch as it's possible to determine this, in your view, firstly, how sincere do you think he was being? And secondly, how plausible do you think that is?
At the danger of coming across as a total coward, I will say that I reserve judgment on many things that concern Arius as a person, because we just know so little about him. And you may have noticed that the people I referenced in my talk, that I actually didn't really want to go there. I mean, but to me, really more significant, at least for the kind of case I wanted to make, are the sort of, let's say, moderate anti-Nicaeans who are not really Arian, who always say they're not Arians, but who think of themselves as just continuing a tradition, and modern scholarship has often said, well, they're originists. I don't even know whether that's true, but I'm sure that many of them were just people who felt that they passed on the faith that they'd received from their fathers. And of course, we come back to the to a point I just made once at the beginning, which is that Nicaea was the first to come up with this idea that there had to be a universal formula of faith. That highlights the fact that it was very hard to say retrospectively what everybody had actually believed, and to an extent what we may see in the 4th century may also just represent sort of regional varieties in faith traditions that had been existing at that time for a long time now. Just one more. Okay, I go back on my word and make one comment on Arius after all. And the one comment I make is that among the things that are often forgotten, I think, well, not by everybody, but I think in the way we people talk about it, is, Arius was old, right? By the time the controversy broke out, he must have been a presbyter for a very long time in Alexandria, and arguably, I see no reason not to believe that what he preached in 318, he'd actually already preached in 280 or 90, or whenever he started with his ministry. Now, there is the further complication, isn't there, that there was a period of persecution happening just before the accession of Constantine, and that made it probably additionally difficult to, let's say, police what was going on in individual churches. That probably also increased the willingness, I mean, this is totally speculative, but may have increased the willingness among Christians to turn a blind eye to this kind of deviancy, because you want to sort of close ranks if you're attacked like that from the outside. So I think that Arius, I see no reason not to believe, whether it's his testimony or just on sort of commonsensical grounds, that the kind of doctrine he was indicted for, he had actually held and talked about for a number of decades at the time already. And so I think he was probably genuine when he said, I've done that now for many years and nobody's ever taken exception to it.
Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Zachhuber. On Newman, I wonder if it is the case that we ought to read the development of doctrine and his account of history along with the grammar of assent, and so the metaphysics, the epistemology, and the history have to be read in line one with another. But in line with this, I know that this is an expertise of yours, the Neo-Chalcedonian period. Leontius of Byzantium, who you know very well, does seem to have quite differently from the 4th century, this quite historical understanding of how things happened, these long florilegia going from Irenaeus on. Can you comment a little on what you think changed in terms of the historical awareness of the church from the 4th, say, through to the 6th centuries, building on your other research?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think a lot. I mean, it would be a separate talk, but it would still be a very interesting one. One could say a sort of second half of my talk to ask, what's the difference between the way the Fathers of Nicaea think about their own theology with regard to or relating to earlier developments, and what would happen in the 5th and even more in the 6th and 7th centuries. It's very clear, right, that not just someone like Leontius in the 6th century, but already someone like Cyril in the 5th finds it impossible not to justify their own position by drawing up patristic statements, patristic testimony, passages from the earlier fathers. But they're doing that for their own, the controversy at the time, right? They're not, perhaps I misunderstood your point, but even Leontius doesn't use Irenaeus to argue that Irenaeus supports Nicaea. He's kind of finding passages there in, or to the extent he is, or the Florilegium that he's using, which is, as people argue, probably a 5th century Florilegium, my goodness. They're trying to piece together citations in support of a particular Christological vision. So what changes? Well, I think what changes is partly that what changes is that in the reception of Nicaea, a new conception of fathers comes into being, where they become an authority sort of in their own right. Now the big problem. No, sorry, whatever. So the massive difficulty for people like Leontius is, of course, that the authorities used by basically every side in the Christological debate are almost the same. It's not entirely true, but it's largely the case that they want to use, well, even if not pre-Nicene, Nicene fathers, people like Nazianzen and Chrysostom and Cyril and so on and so forth. So they're basically debating about the right to see themselves in the tradition of a fairly firmly defined canon of fathers, and that's the canon of Nicene fathers. This is sprinkling of earlier ones, but no more than that.
We have come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank Professor Zachhuber for setting us off in such a rich way. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brendan Wolfe, who will speak to us about his talk is entitled The Other Side of the Hill, Revisiting Arianism. He is the principal editor of the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology, and he is also the co-author with Oliver Langworthy and Matthias Gassman of Arianism Revisited, this one here, an introduction to non-Nicene theologies, published this year by Fortress Press. Again, we'll hear him speak about the other side of the hill, revisiting Arianism. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and for this kind introduction. As we come to the end of this anniversary year, I would like to reflect on how the trajectory of the 4th century Trinitarian controversy was received by those whose theology did not prevail. The history of the Council and its opponents, and so of non-Nicene Christianity, reaches us above all through pro-Nicene writers. This is true of our 4th century sources, but it's equally true of the 5th century historians that offer narratives of the controversy and preserve key 4th century documents. The famous church historians Socrates, Sozomen, and Theodoret tend to cast the whole story from its beginning as a contest between the Orthodox and the Arians. To turn, as I propose we do this afternoon, to non-Nicene perspectives on that same history is therefore to uncover a vital control on our overarching sense of what the controversy was about. Of necessity, this approach directs our attention not to the council itself, but to the perspectives that arose across the rest of the century. Now, with any luck, you have a handout. I have done my best to strip out the profuse number of names necessary to understand the developments of Trinitarian thought after Nicaea, and I got it down to the number that is on that handout. I would go even lower. I would accept one of the key historiographical questions, which I hope to address, but which faces all scholars looking at this time and field, is the degree to which individual scholars are individual churchmen are accurately captured or adumbrated by our scholarly heuristics. To say that again, it's very difficult to say in advance whether it's going to be the case that speaking of broad groups brings us greater clarity than speaking of individuals. So please, and perhaps the handout will be of use in the rest of the conference as well. As we know, opposition to Nicaea in the first decades after the council centered on those around Eusebius. That's Eusebius of Nicomedia, one of the most influential bishops in the empire, and one to whom Arius appealed. As the years passed, other bishops, schools, and alliances emerged from within the conceptual space or the personal networks represented by Eusebius' circle. For clarity, scholars have long used a set of labels to try to group or describe these positions. We call homoiousian the view that the Son is like the Father in essence, in contrast, of course, to Nicaea's of one essence or of one substance, the homoousion, as we know. We call its defenders homoiousians as well, so both the people and the position. We call heterousian, or anomian, the view that the Son is unlike the Father in essence. And we associate that view above all with Eunomius of Cyzicus and his teacher Aetius, the most acute theologians of that tendency, so much so that eunomian, after Eunomius, is also a common designator. Most confusingly, we give the name homoion, or homian, to 3 related things. To the view that the Son is like the Father according to the Scriptures, avoiding the language of essence, sometimes explicitly. To the councils that promulgated such a confession, especially Rimini in 359 and its companion councils in the East, companion and successor councils in the East. And finally, to the promoters of those confessions, even when their own thought was markedly more subordinationist. Earlier scholarship, of course, used different labels. It called the homoiousians semi-Arians, the homoians simply Arians, and that's also the usage of the contemporary imperial legal codes. Modern scholarship, wary of polemic, has rejected semi-Arian altogether, has tended to see the homoians as moderates, as some of what we were just hearing in Professor Zachhuber's excellent opening. Sometimes this moderation is construed as rejecting both homoousian and heterousian extremes, so via media. And it's treated the eunomians, or anomians, as the true heirs of Arius' radicalism. You may already be thinking of evidence that complements or contradicts these broad impressions. With our remaining time, however, I wish to focus on 2 lines of non-Nicene historical reflection that took quite a different view. The eunomian tradition, represented by Philostorgius, and the homoian tradition, represented by Maximinus and the anonymous Bobbio polemicist. So we begin with Philostorgius, who appears, of course, on your handout, but I'll say again, he's born at Borissus in Cappadocia. He was a cradle eunomian. He had met the elderly Eunomius at Constantinople, though he knew the latter's teacher Aetius only, and his career only secondhand. His 12-book history drew on a range of Christian and secular sources, including an earlier Homoian chronicle. We possess it only in the long epitome made by Photius, the 9th century patriarch of Constantinople, by which time, of course, Nicaeanism was the only option, together with paraphrased fragments in other Byzantine writers. In modern English translation, it runs to about 160 pages, surviving, a slender survival, one that gives us a sustained ante-Nicene narrative of the 4th century church. Philostorgius' curiosity extended well beyond theology. His paraphrasers preserved digressions on the wonders of the Indian Ocean region, the geography of Eden's rivers, the apocalyptic themes through which he understood the travails of what, by his day, had become a small, fractious, and embattled church of true believers. Yet, like the pro-Nicene historians, he organizes his story around two arcs. First, the shifting policies of imperial rulers. Second, the struggle between two opposed theological camps. Where the pro-Nicenes opposed Arians to the defenders of orthodoxy, Philostorgius set heterousios, so the claim of difference in essence, heterousios and its defenders against various expressions of the Nicene homoousios. He reads the 5th century Eunomian experience of marginalization under a dominant pro-Nicene establishment back to the controversy's beginning. The results can be jarring. Eusebius of Nicomedia and his allies, he tells us, substituted homoiousios for homoousios in their subscriptions at Nicaea. He tries to defend his heroes, in other words, from having signed on to something he would call heretical. The Emperor Constantine himself is claimed later in his life to have endorsed the heterousios. Philostorgius repeatedly casts prominent critics of Nicaea, including the main homoiousian leaders, as defenders of the homoousios. Now, he's not blind to reality. He does recognize that these figures defended other views, sometimes noting this in close proximity to the aspersions he casts on their homoousianism. He is simply not interested in subtlety, any more than Athanasius had been. For an ardent pro-Nicene, all the alternatives either coalesced with their view or entailed Arianism. For Philostorgius, everything that was not heterousian basically amounted to homoousianism. Now, this view is not a precise mirror image for the post-Athanasian pro-Nicene one. The dividing line does not split all deniers of Trinitarian equality from Nicenes, but a reductionist, lumped-together Nicenism from hardline heterousianism. Accordingly, Philostorgius has his own alternative grasp of the controversy's theological and church-political arc. Though he does not condemn Arius as a heretic, he does criticize him for thinking God beyond human comprehension. Instead, for him, the foremost champion of heterousian orthodoxy was Eusebius of Nicomedia. Philostorgius notes the formation of Eusebius and several other defenders of the heterousian doctrine by the exegete and martyr Lucian of Antioch. Also, that association, confirmed by Arius' letter to Eusebius, has never ceased to excite historian speculation. But Philostorgius does not actually trace the theological line directly to Lucian himself, who figures chiefly as a martyr. Much clearer is the relationship between this early generation and the next, as Philostorgius describes Aetius' teaching by the Lucianists Athanasius of Sarbus, Antony of Tarsus, and Leontius of Antioch, who had ordained him deacon, and Paulinus of Tyre, recipient of an extant letter from Eusebius of Nicomedia. Thereafter, the heroes of orthodoxy are Aetius himself and Eunomius, supported by churchmen such as the miracle-working missionary bishop at large Theophilus the Indian, who may have been from somewhere on the way to India, like Yemen or Socotra. In the unfolding narrative, the homoiousians, men like Basil of Ancyra and Eustachius of Sebasta, are key enemies. The homoians play a more complex role. They were dominant when Eunomius and Aetius split away from the mainstream church. But precisely because he casts the adherents of homoousios as the core enemy, they cannot serve as a consistent foil. In fact, it is doubtful that a Homoian party appears at all in Philostorgius' account of the period, from 359 to the reign of Theodosius, in which the Homoian Creed was the regnant dogma in the East. The narrative operates at a finer grain than that, centering not on the doctrinal commonalities among the churchmen who advanced the Homoian Creed of Constantinople, but on their relationship with the two Heterousian stalwarts at the heart of the Eunomian vision of the 4th century church. Philostorgius distinguishes between Acacius of Caesarea as an opponent and his colleagues Eudoxius of Constantinople and Euzoius of Antioch, who inclined towards the Heterousios. These are the great leaders of Homoianism in that time. According to Photius's notes on his epitome, Acacius was the leading villain of the whole thing, and Philostorgius' extant criticisms bear distinct doctrinal overtones. He alleges that Acacius attacked Eudoxius before the Emperor Constantius II for ordaining a protege of Aetius, and that Acacius promoted actual Homoousian, that is, Nicene bishops. So Acacius is a traitor and possibly a secret Nicene. The other Homoian bishops, Eudoxius and Euzoius, appear in quite a different light. Philostorgius traces out the slow sundering of relations between them and Eunomius, as the two leaders repeatedly failed to restore Aetius after his deposition in the year 359 or 360. Association with Acacius does not directly taint them, and indeed doctrinal difference plays a minimal role. Eunomius, to Philostorgius' understanding, did declare the Son to be like according to the Scriptures, the putative shibboleth of the other party, the Homoian crew, and upheld the Son's passionless begetting by the Father. The root of the ultimate schism with Eudoxius, again, never speaking of parties, always speaking of individuals, lay in very personal church politics. Under the pagan emperor Julian, Aetius was in theory restored by a small synod held at Antioch, and was in fact even ordained bishop with Eudoxius' acquiescence at Constantinople itself. Neither prelate would fully see those actions through, and so when Eunomius finally formed a schismatic hierarchy of his own, Eudoxius and Euzoius, like other one-time supporters, were embittered against both Aetius and Eunomius. Thus, the formation of a separate hierarchy, what we have chosen to view as different parties or churches, was due to contingent circumstance in Philostorgius' narrative, and not, on his own Eunomian telling, to an unbridgeable difference of conviction. Separation, however, encouraged both animosity and substantive difference. Philostorgius is fiercely negative about the later Homoian leaders in the East, who condemned Eunomius as a mere anomian, a stereotype that Philostorgius rejects absolutely. He accuses these Homoians of muddling the true teaching about Christ's body, and, if a more distant source can be trusted, about his creation by God. Finally, when treating the events of 381, Philostorgius offers what amounts to a summative and highly negative judgment on the Homoian tradition. Here he links the rejection of ousia and hypostasis in the Homoian creeds to Arius' own teaching, and accuses both the heresiarch and the Homoian creeds of undermining divine simplicity by asserting the ineffability of God. None of the heresies into which the followers of Arius split was ultimately able to explain the Son's likeness to the Father. Whether they saw it as likeness in foreknowledge, nature, or the power to create, for Philostorgius, all their views ultimately collapsed into the one central heresy of the 4th century, the homoousion, Nicaea. What then does Philostorgius see as the division between the church, his church, and the Homoians? In the historical course of their separation, acceptance of the Homoian creeds and rejection of Aetius had gone together, but the stress lay on the latter. Their core doctrinal distinctive was not the homoios that has now given the Homoians their name, at least among us, but a peculiarity that Philostorgius' early champions of the heterousios had lived with or even endorsed, the idea that the Son's begetting is unknowable. From one perspective, that implicit in Philostorgius' account, in Book 2 of Arius and his Lucianist Eusebian supporters, The Arians could be construed as an imperfectly orthodox element aligned with the true Heterousian tradition. Over time, however, that alignment had sundered. Confusion and multiplicity marked the inheritors of Arius' theology, who had rejected the truth and its defenders. The implication is stupendous, although it's long foreshadowed in Philostorgus' text, that Aetius' rejection of ordination by one of Arius' most loyal allies already suggests. Philostorgus' argument, drawn to its logical conclusion, is that Arius' own doctrine was, in fact, homoousian, or at least pointed in that direction. So, Arius is a heretic for Philostorgus because he is Nicene, or at least because his teaching must lead to Nicaea. Now, looking now to the other tradition, there is no Homoian church history to compare. To reconstruct even a shadowy outline of Latin Homoian perceptions of the past, we are reliant on just two texts. The first is the anthology produced by Maximinus, sometime a disputant with St. Augustine. He added an introduction and conclusion to the rebuttal of St. Ambrose by Homoian Bishop Palladius of Ratiara from their confrontation at the Council of Aquileia in 381. The second source are the rewritten leaves of the ante-Nicene polemic preserved at Bobbio in Italy. Together, these offer nothing as detailed as Philostorgus' rereading of the church politics of the 4th century. They do, however, yield a suggestive and remarkably Arian perspective on the broad arc of theological history. Maximinus' introduction is a running elaboration on Palladius' thoughts, his forebear's thoughts. Palladius had objected that St. Ambrose ought to have drawn his idolatry, as he calls it, the belief in 3 co-equal gods. This is the normal accusation against Nicenes, that if all 3 persons are equally God, you've got 3 gods there, you're not a monotheist anymore. So you're an idol worshipper, and that ought to have come from Demetrianus. Maximinus, in his sort of commentary, correctly identifies Demetrianus as an anti-Christian interlocutor of Cyprian of Carthage, of course on your handout, martyred in 258, and the preeminent father of the pre-Nicene Latin Church. He quotes a long section from Cyprian's apology to Demetrianus. The passage not only accuses Ambrose of continuing pagan assaults on persecuted Christians, when he insinuated that the barbarian invasions were divine punishment on Arian impiety, it also allows Maximinus to represent his view of God as Cyprian's, before it was ever Arius's. What he does with Arius himself is even more striking. Palladius had protested Ambrose's invidious linking of his party's doctrine to Arius's name. Ambrose is trying to hang the name of Arius around these Homoian leaders' neck. But, of course, Palladius reiterated his scriptural defense at Aquileia of the profession quoted by Ambrose from Arius' letter to Alexander of the supremacy of the one only true God. So he won't accept the name of Arius, but he will make a scriptural defense of one of a quotation from Arius. Palladius says this indirectly, therefore, but Maximinus is the counterexample to the claim I expect we have all heard, that no one ever owns the name of Arius after his death. Maximinus says outright, this belief is Arius' Christian profession according to divine teaching. Maximinus claims that he will buttress Arius' teaching with the professions and names of a great many bishops, including Theognis of Nicaea and Eusebius the historian, that is, of Caesarea. The only profession he actually reproduces, however, is that of the Gothic missionary and bishop Wulfila, as relayed by Wulfila's follower Auxentius of Durostorum. Maximinus' failure to provide other professions is tantalizing. Which text did he have in mind? Our best clue is offered by the Bobbio polemicist. Much of his work is taken up in theological and exegetical exposition, or in rebutting his Nicene opponents, including Ambrose and Hilary of Poitiers. In what might be a build-up to something like Palladius' accusation of Nicene tritheism, he quotes an alleged letter from Constantine, which acknowledges divine wrath, or so he implies anyway, at polytheism, and introduces a letter of Constantius, now lost to an unidentified synod. The professions of emperors friendly to his side could serve as evidence in an anti-Nicene case. So could the arguments of Arius' early supporters. He quotes an appeal to tradition, including the 3rd century bishop Dionysius of Alexandria by Athanasius of Anaxarchus, said by his namesake from Alexandria to have defended Arius' belief in the ex nihilo creation of the sun, which is an extremely unusual stance. This other Athanasius is no less radical here, asserting boldly, in a paraphrase of Philippians 2:6, that Christ did not think he was on equal terms with God. Equally subordinationist quotations follow from other sources, which assert the superiority of the unbegotten Father, and yet also the propriety of venerating the begotten Son. These snippets of lost polemic represent the kind of material Maximinus might have cited from others in his tradition had he fully worked up his exposition. What we have now are probably just notes. Supplemented by elements in other texts, such as his debate with Augustine, they let us trace out a Homoian vision of the golden thread of Orthodox non-Nicene tradition. At the beginning of the arc is St. Cyprian, the most venerable of the Latin fathers. Implicitly, the whole pre-Nicene church stands with him. One might point specifically to Dionysius or to the martyr Lucian, who was honored by one of the Homoian commentators. Next come Arius and his allies, exemplified by Theognis, Eusebius of Caesarea, Athanasius of Anaxarchus. After him come the worthies named by Maximinus to Augustine, the conciliar fathers at Rimini. Remember, we said one of the definitions of Homoian is adherent, or is the propounders of the Council of Rimini. Spanning the gap then into the 380s are the figures named in the texts interwoven with Maximinus's own: Palladius, Wulfila, Auxentius of Milan, Demophilus, Auxentius of Durostorum, a who's who of stalwart Homoianism from Constantinople westwards. Later come, implicitly, the polemicists themselves. The Bobbio polemicist might have been writing as early as the 380s and could be one of the Homoian churchmen known to us. Maximinus was writing no earlier than the promulgation of the Theodosian Code in 438, in a Latin world increasingly barbarian, and so, despite his antipathy for the conquerors, also increasingly Homoian. The shift in church politics had allowed a new openness about the continuity of Homoian conviction with its early 4th century predecessors. In 427, while safe beneath the aegis of a Roman general, Maximinus could publicly expound the theology of his church, but he also reminded Augustine of the tortures a hostile imperial establishment could visit upon him for his fidelity. In the 440s, there was no longer any need to foreground the risk of persecution and no need to dissemble. His church was not Arian. The continuity, as Maximinus saw it with Cyprian, proved that. Arius, however, had been a genuine spokesman for the true doctrine of God, which the Nicenes had rejected and Palladius had so gloriously upheld beneath their treacherous onslaught. Let's conclude. Philostorgius, the Eunomian, rejected Arius as teaching a theology which ultimately entailed the homoousion. Maximinus, the Homoian, embraced Arius as part of the intellectual history of his church. We do not have to accept either claim, especially since both are contradicted by what we think we know of Arius' own writings in the Thalia. We cannot fail to note, however, that those claims accord better with the ancient Nicene polemic than they do with modern scholarly categories. What should we then take away from this account? In addition to the evergreen reminder to hold our scholarly heuristics lightly, I will suggest 3 possibilities. First, by the time of our sources, Nicenism predominated. We may ask ourselves whether the numerically and juridically inferior Homoians had perhaps accepted the characterization of Nicene polemic for themselves. That is, they'd finally accepted having the name Arius hung around their necks. Certainly people do sometimes internalize the labels of their adversaries, and we should take care about the insults we direct at our opponents, lest they live down to them. In this case, however, Arius is a link in a chain stretching to the great St. Cyprian, which has little to do with a Nicene forced imposition or situation of Arius' thought. A second implication, some such as Neil MacLean, for example, have thought to detect a potential rapprochement between Homoian and Eunomian around the 383 Council of the Sects in Constantinople. We may ask whether the mutual silence, that is, the relative invisibility of the Homoians in Philostorgius' account and of the Eunomians in Maximinus' story, and other Homoian sources, indicates that as the 380s receded into memory, the sundered wings of the old non-Nicene alliance drew back together. Certainly, though, they did not in church political or legal terms. And to make that quite concrete, Gothic Homoian kingdoms were able simply to transpose or adopt imperial anti-Eunomian legislation into their own codes without any tension. So in countries, successor states, I suppose, where Homoianism was the official doctrine, Eunomianism was banned by simply copying Nicene imperial legislation. We can't rule out the possibility, though, that rapprochement was something to which these authors may have been open. Finally, on the simplest level, examining non-Nicene historiography is an opportunity to see what non-Nicenes actually thought. About God, to be sure, but also about the persons and events which had shaped the controversies through which they, too, had lived. It enables us to calibrate pro-Nicene narratives on which we inevitably depend against views from the other side. It can therefore serve as a curb against an over-aggressive reading between the lines of pro-Nicene writing. Scholars have wanted, rightly, to understand thinkers such as Arius and Eunomius on their own terms. We risk starting to see pro-Nicene writers through black-tinted lenses, to forget that theirs are the mistakes, invectives, and distortions we can still read, not the only ones that were committed, and not always the worst. Even more subtly, we may begin to mistake our best rationalizations of non-Nicene thinking for the non-Nicenes' actual motivation. The remnants of non-Nicene historical reflection cut against both pro-Nicene and modern perspectives. Against the pro-Nicenes by tracing alternative lines of theological authority from before the controversies beginning to the 5th century, but against modern views as well by validating the pro-Nicene stress on Arius, his early supporters, and the doctrine of the Son's inferiority to the Father. To study these remnants is to look at the other side of the hill, or, in a metaphor I owe to Andrew Louth, the reverse side of a tapestry. Less brilliant, perhaps, but with certain threads and patterns visible, which would otherwise be obscure. Thank you.
In what way do those you've been describing cast light on aspects of Nicene theology that we might otherwise miss? Do we see the Creed, or do we see the Nicene canons in a fresh way because of them, or do they help us understand the positions they rejected?
Well, I would make a distinction. The historians about whom I have been speaking, who are drawing these alternative lines of historical authority from the past, from before the Council, probably don't cast an enormous amount of light on Nicene theology. There are, however, texts of non-Nicene sources that are not primarily historical, that are engaged in some form of theology. And those, I think, help us to understand in a variety of ways. One is the sheer difficulty of pinning people down, because as Professor Zachhuber mentioned, most of the language that's being used is biblical, on which there is, in some sense, complete consensus. It may be that it was a necessary move to go outside the Bible to take some language in order actually to specify what the biblical witness is being confessed as saying. And we can see that by reading these non-Nicene theologians who are reading the same scriptures and interpreting them in internally consistent ways.
Yeah. Before I ask more questions, go here, please. Yes, just here.
Thank you so much. That was characteristically erudite and great fun. And I'm sure you know what I'm going to ask about Homoeanism, or Homoians, because we've been debating this for a long time. Why are you still using the word Homoean? I mean, what do you make of the argument that there's such a difference between like the Father in all things and like the Father according to the Scriptures, that you're really talking about two completely different theologies which have really very little in common? Would you be up for something like Rimanians or something like that? I mean, obviously I understand why you don't want to use Arians, and obviously for you, where it's Western Germanic theology that you're obviously the particular expert in, you know, you need a good term, but are you, would you still defend Homoeanism? Would you think of something like Rimaniism? Is there any other alternative?
Yeah, Rimanists or Arianisms or something does make a certain amount of sense. I think I somewhat alluded to this at the beginning. As soon as we start to critique our terms, we find that they all fall apart and we can't speak anymore. And then we're just reading out massive lists of names, and that's it. No one can follow anymore. So we need these heuristics. So there's two questions, really. Is Homoian a good name for the group in question, and is that group cutting reality at the joints, or is this a kind of fake conglomeration? Is it a good name? Not really. Not really of the doctrine that the people involved were teaching, because they were, exactly as you say, they were under the sort of shroud of saying that father and son were like each other as fathers and sons are like each other, or as according to the Scriptures. They were saying pretty radically subordinationist things. They weren't eunomians, though. We do need to distinguish them. There are these differences about the ineffable begetting and the knowability of the Father's essence and a few other things which really do mark eunomians out as distinct. So maybe what we need to call them is something like non-eunomian quasi-heterousians or something, right? But it becomes a bit much. So the point of using the word homoian now is to say it's the people who are advocating the creeds which are insisting on homoios as a sufficient word, or as far as they're willing to go, even though actually mostly they're going in the other direction altogether. So yeah, I mean, I'd be open to Wolfe as a name for all of them or something. He is probably the grandest theologian of their number, actually, but we have none of his texts except the confession as recorded by his student, and obviously his Bible translation. So I have thought for better terms. One would like better terms for all of these people: inequalists, subordinationists, etc. Who knows? I would also, just to answer a question you didn't ask, I'd be slightly cautious about losing the word Arian altogether, because, as I think I've pointed out here, there is a sense in which, at least in the Latin West, the people who were legally called Arians were the only people willing to put Arius in their theological genealogies. And that is significant.
Might you say a couple of words distinguishing theologically the two groups you've been describing for those for whom these words are newer?
Yes. I mean, again, that's a difficult thing. So we have there's two ways of reading this situation, really. When you have effectively four parties in the church. Let's pretend for a moment that everything I've said about the inadequacy of party language is not true, and just talk about parties. Let's say we have four parties in the church. We have Nicenes, who believe the Father and Son to be of the same substance. We have what we call Homoiousians, who believe the Father and the Son to be like in substance, but not the same substance, because after all, when you say the same substance, that could mean there's some underlying thing of which they're both expressions. They want to avoid that. And then you have Homoians, who at least ostensibly want to avoid any non-biblical language at all, speak only of likeness in the way that any father is like any son, And then finally, the heterousians who want to say, no, they're not even alike at all when it comes to ousia. It's not just that we shouldn't talk about ousia or that ousia is a meaningless term. It is a meaningful term, and we can use it to say father and son are unlike. Okay, if those are the parties, the key question is really where we see homoians aligning. Are the things I've just reported, which are taken from their conciliar documents and theses and so on, are those to be understood as their actual doctrine, in which case they're very similar to the homoiousians, to the second group, and we have a kind of middle that's a moderate middle with Nicene extremists and heterousian extremists? Or are those to be taken as attempts to achieve peace in the church or pull the wool over people's eyes, and actually they're to be understood as very, very similar to the heterousians? In the latter case, your question has force. How do we distinguish them from other heterousians? Well, Eunomius thought a lot of kind of extraordinary things about how the fact that God the Father was unbegotten, which is agreed, of course, by everybody, was not only unimportant thing to say about him, not only the main thing to say about him, but the thing that elaborated every other thing. His unbegottenness is his essence in some sense, and therefore we can know the essence of God. And there is no ineffability, there is a kind of a radical simplicity which other theologians, even who wanted to make some of those distinctions, would not have gone for. So that would be the point at which distinction could be most clearly observed.
So we still have a few minutes when we can ask one more thing then before we let people go. Do you think you can say anything about what things we would recognize as being good things that these two groups were seeking? What good things were they seeking amidst the confusions?
That's also a good question. That question is in some ways the origin of engaging in this project. I think the fullest answer has to tie in all the rejectors of Nicaea, because they are all trying to articulate the monarchy of the Father, both in both senses of arche, of rule, but also of origin, which is a common doctrine. They're trying to protect that, and they're trying to protect God the Father. They're trying to protect real divinity from from a sort of, well, let's put it this way. Imagine being a Christian in the 4th century and having to defend to pagans whom you have just mocked for all the silly things Zeus gets up to in their legends. You have to defend God, the creator of the universe, being born as a baby, and so on. So they want to somehow preserve elements of divinity from the incarnation. Now, is that a good thing or not? Obviously, in one sense, it's a very bad thing. It's a rejection of the central doctrine of Christianity. But, of course, even other, many later centuries have wrestled with this. In the Reformation, there's questions about whether there's an unincarnate tale of the second person of the Trinity, which somehow remains in heaven. That's a similar question of how do we relate divinity in its complete otherness from creation when we're also speaking of an incarnation. So it's an inescapable matter for any Christian theologian.
Thank you for such a rich talk and for preparing us for all that we're going to be doing later this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coffee in the St. Cross Common Room, across the quad, 2 ways to go. You can go through the back doors, which will now open, through the west doors, and around into the glass doors, or you can go back through the lodge. We'll return here for 4 o'clock. Some more chairs will magically appear, and I'll encourage those of you who may have bags or things in your chairs to keep those to yourself. The next talk, and maybe even move in to make spaces if we need to do that. We'll come back Excuse me. We'll come back at 4 o'clock for the Reverend Dr. Mark Smith and Nicaea, then and now, the Council after 1700 years. See you at 4.